Over 24 hours since we found out the man behind the Boston bombings was this man, 23-year-old Mark Anthony Condit. And while we know the bomber's name and the age, there are still so many questions that remain, particularly why. And I want to bring in right now Dr. Nancy Zarse. She is a forensic psychologist, professor at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. Thank you so much for coming in today. We always love talking with you. You know, when we talk about this individual, there is so very little for us to know. And police said that there is this video that outlines a confession and details every single bombing, so they don't think at this point that it has anything to do with hate. But something must have been driving him.
Well, typically what we see, as we've said in many of these cases, it's about a grievance. And that grievance, they then begin to fixate on that grievance, and that fuels them towards a pathway to violence. But in about 40% of cases, we never learn a motive.
Well, that's so very true. Now, we were talking off camera in the break, and you said we need to really distinguish the difference between a hunter and a howler. What does that mean?
Okay, so if you remember, we've talked about that pathway to intended violence. That starts with a grievance, sense of injustice, real or perceived, that must be avenged. And then it goes to ideation. In between there, we can differentiate between a hunter and a howler. A howler, their intent is to cause fear, to express a grievance, and essentially to scare you. Not so much terror, but terrify. Okay, so to scare you. A hunter's grievance actually fuels movement down the pathway to intended violence. So if you think about, sometimes somebody will say to you, I'm going to get you. Okay, right. We don't know what they're going to do. We don't know if they have means to do anything. That could be a howler who's not going to move beyond step one.
Right.
The hunter is someone who's then going to decide that violence is the only means, then start to research a plan, then start to acquire the items for the plan, and move up that pathway to intended violence.
But using, and that's very interesting, but using explosives to do this, instead of somebody going into a school with an AR-15 that we have seen in the past, what does that tell you about the method they chose?
Now, that's curious. So it could be that there's an attempt to kind of distance the individual from the acts of violence, and a sense of looking for anonymity. And it could be a bit of a challenge. I'm smarter than the police. You've underestimated me in the past. I'm going to show you what I can do.
Now, these incidents, in every case, you know, it costs a lot of money, the investigation, the therapy that people need. I mean, there are costs associated with all of these casualties.
The costs are staggering. After the Aurora movie theater massacre, they estimate it cost $110 million, the Pulse nightclub $360 million, and the Las Vegas shooting $2 billion. If we could take a fraction of that money and dedicate it to prevention, and if we even targeted 4 specific areas, we looked at education, we looked at identification of risk, of people at risk, we looked at methods of intervention, and managing long-term cases. Educate, identify, intervene, and manage. This man, Anthony, Mr. Condit, in this case, you know, he was homeschooled, which is an indication quite possibly to me, and I don't want to say anything bad about homeschooling, because I know people who have been homeschooled, and they are wonderful people, and it's not known if he was socialized at all. Do you think that may have played a factor in it? It sounds like he was very close to his father, too, who had no clue that this was going on. We don't necessarily see any connection between homeschooling, and actually an awful lot of the parents who homeschool spend a significant amount of time making sure that they are socializing their children while simply educating at home.
And he could have been. We don't know.
So I don't know that I would focus so much on the homeschooling. What I do know that we see precipitating a lot of these mass casualty events are loss. And the loss is, that there's some experience of loss. It could be a relationship, it could be academic failure, it could be a job. And keep in mind that loss is as defined by the individual. I had a client say to me one time, every head is a world, Doc. Get inside the head of the other is a world.
Okay, it's a world.
Every head is a world, Doc. So we need to get out of our heads and into the individual's head in front of us. How do they define loss, and how upsetting is it to that individual?
Dr. Nancy Zarse, thank you so much for coming on today. We always love hearing from you and hearing what you have to say about these, because they are fascinating cases.
And sad.
You know, fascinating and very sad, exactly tragic.